You're listening to the Inside the Mix podcast with your host, Mark Matthews.
Hey folks, and in this episode, I am very excited to welcome my guest today. A huge influence on me as a mixing engineer and just in music in general. And I was saying off air, probably my most referenced author when I was doing my master's degree, Bobby Owsinski. Hi Bobby, thank you for joining me today. I'm extremely excited about this. How are you today?
Thank you for having me, Mark. I'm pleased to be here.
Fantastic. So I've got to do a shout out to Jay Gilbert of the Your Morning Coffee podcast who put me in touch with Bobby. So and also go check that episode out as well, episode 130. So for those of you who aren't familiar, I've just got a brief bio here for Bobby. So he's a renowned music producer, author and educator known for his expertise in music production, audio engineering and the music business, and he hosts the Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle podcast. Do go check that out. There will be a link in the episode description, offering invaluable insights and interviews with industry experts. And as a creator of online courses and best-selling books like the Mixing Engineer's Handbook, so I've got a copy of it right here. This is the third edition. Fantastic book. The Recording Engineer's Handbook, and most recently, the Musician's AI Handbook. Bobby equips musicians and producers with the skills needed for success in the music industry. And today's chat is going to be about AI. So it leans into the recent book, The Musician's AI Handbook, and how artists can use it to enhance and promote their music using AI, as described by Bobby himself. So I thought it'd be a good place to start, Bobby, would be with the book structure itself. So it's structured in three distinct sections. Can you talk a bit about those sections and explain the rationale behind organizing the book in that way?
Well, the first section is primarily about the basics of AI, explaining all the buzzwords that we know, that we hear, and sometimes confuse. Sometimes we mean one thing and it's actually another. And just in terms of what the normal terms that we hear. The second part of that would be AI copyright, which is very blurry and nebulous right now. And it's clearing up a little bit, but in fact there's a lot of things that you have to watch out for when you are using an AI platform of any type. Second section is all about using AI in audio, and that includes generating AI music, using it in music production, using it just for audio tasks like EQ, limiting, things like that, compression, source separation, which it's very good at, noise reduction, it's extremely good at that, getting better all the time. And then the third section is all about using it for promotion, because certainly it's very good at generating music videos. It's very good at generating copy for instance, a bio for you, or maybe a release strategy or anything like that. Graphics is exceptionally good at that and getting better all the time. So that's the three different sections. And again, the reason why is I didn't want one section to blur into another one, so I kind of defined the intersection between them a little bit, just so it's easier to get through the book.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to separate it. And particularly what I really like about the book is going through it. It's not you're describing and educating the reader on these different facets of AI, but you're also giving sort of steps. For example, with the marketing side of things, you're saying, okay, well, these are the chatbots that you can use, ChatGPT, Bard, which is now Gemini, I believe. But you're also giving, okay, so this is a breakdown of the prompts that you can use when you're using this particular platform, and also with the VST plugins and those bits and pieces as well. So I think that's really, really useful, actually. Okay, so this is what you can use, but here's how you can actually put it into action. Going back to the first chapter, and because I'm a big advocate of AI in itself, is there like a particular part of AI that if you were new to it, you should get started with? Because there's things like neural networks, there's large language models and deep learning. Is there, like, if you really wanted to understand how it's all put together, is there a particular part to start with, do you think?
Honestly, the whole idea behind that chapter was to bust some myths primarily. And it's mostly like, okay, there's a difference between a large language model and a neural network, for instance. And there are many times when a lot of these terms are used interchangeably and they shouldn't be. So it's mostly like, let me put this into layman's terms so you don't have to be a computer engineer, computer science major to get through it.
Yeah.
And just understand that there are differences, and there's a history here. This isn't something that just started last year. In fact, it's been going since the 1950s, the whole theory behind artificial intelligence. So just to kind of break it down, it's like, okay, don't be overwhelmed by this, because it's not as it's not as daunting as you may believe. Again, I was trying to put it in terms where it doesn't feel like it's daunting, or it's like, oh yeah, I can understand it. Oh, I get that. So that was the whole purpose behind that. Ultimately, what's going to happen is this will all somewhat blend into the background.
Yeah.
In that, it's beginning to happen already, where we're seeing that things are happening so automatically for us when it comes to using any kind of AI platform that we're not even thinking about those buzzwords so much as we were in the beginning.
Yeah, and I don't know, the audience listening, I don't know about yourself, but now whenever I look for new platforms, I think one of the first things I generally look for now is how they incorporate AI. Maybe it's because I just love AI and artificial intelligence and everything that comes with it. Albeit there are caveats involved with that with regards to copyright and everything else. And as you say, we're sort of reading the book as well. You say that different parts of the world in terms of the copyright law it does fluctuate. But I'll let the readers go into that when they read the book. But I find that, when I'm looking at a new platform, I'm thinking, okay, well, how have they used AI in this? Because I did notice, and Riverside, I've said it a few times on the podcast, sort of in the last 12 months, 18 months, when I first started using it, there probably was some AI. I can't quite remember, but it's come on leaps and bounds in the last year, 18 months, and we're probably doing them a shout out here to get some sort of commission or something. But it's come on leaps and bounds, and I'm really excited to see how it's going to be in sort of the next 5-10 years and where we're at. It would be very, very interesting in a good way, I would imagine. So with regards to opportunities for enhancing music, you sort of explore the opportunities AI presents for doing that with music production. Can you talk a bit about some of the innovative ways artists can sort of leverage AI tools to elevate their compositions and arrangements?
What I found most interesting as a player myself was something like Scalar 2, where that's a very, very deep program, but you don't have to go so deep in it that you can't use it. But what I found that I really liked was the suggestions for chord changes that I never would have thought of, especially when it comes to turnarounds. It's like, oh, that is such a good idea. And I think AI is brilliant for that, not necessarily for composition, and you don't want it to take over your creativity. And that's a big fear that a lot of people have. But the fact of the matter is, it can give you an idea where you thought, oh, I never would have went there before if it wasn't for that. Same with lyrics. You can take any number of lyric generators that are out there, and many of them are just based on ChatGPT anyway, but if you're hopeless at writing lyrics, then it will write some for you. But if, in fact, you're any good at all, there are times when you just need a word or you just need a phrase, and it will pop up something that you'll go, I can use this. This is great. So just in terms of how it can help you going to a place that you never thought of, but a good place, I think it's invaluable for that. But you have to approach it with that in mind, not like this is going to do everything for me, because although it can, it's not going to do it as well as you. There's a big differentiation between, and let me just go back for a second.
Yeah.
One of the things that people are afraid of, and I know before I wrote this book, I put a survey out to my list, which is quite large. And I asked them about this. And I asked them, what problems do you have with AI, or potential problems or fears? And two came up. One was, it's going to take away my creativity. And the second one was, it's moving so fast that whatever I learned today is going to be outdated tomorrow. Well, in terms of losing the creativity, it's really good at doing 80% of the creative process. but it does require you to finish it off. AI is good at certain things, but it's not good at nuances, and humans are really good at nuances.
Yeah.
So that's a differentiation right there. The second thing, the second fear about it moving so fast, yeah, it really is. But the basics, like what I outlined in chapter 1, for instance, the basics of AI, they're not going to change. So that's all the same stuff. We're building on that, but it's, there's a history there. That's certainly not going to change. And the basics of AI are not going to change. So I think, if anything, it's going to get easier to use. The biggest hassle I have with AI in general right now, especially with graphics platforms, video platforms, things like that, is the interface is kind of clunky. And I think that's where the next leap is going to come, where we're going to find cleaner interfaces that will allow us to do more without having to, basically put a chapter in a book as a prompt.
Yes, yeah, I would agree with that. Some of the interfaces I've seen, I know there's a particular one that is an image generator, and I cannot remember the name of it, but I think you have to join the Discord or something along those lines and there's just bits and pieces to it. At the moment, that to me is a barrier to use it, for me. I don't know
That's
about you.
Mid-Journey you're probably talking about.
Yeah,
yes, right.
I think it is. Yeah.
And I find it clunky as well. It's like, why should I have to do this? And then, again, it's not easy, because when you generate something, you're generating it in the Discord group, so everybody's seeing it. And it's like, I don't want people to see it right now. I'm just playing with this. I'm experimenting. So
yeah. I can see how that would change with time. And I think maybe at the moment, because it is it's not really novel. Like you say, it's been around for decades. But in that sort of scenario, maybe it's a bit novel. And they think, actually, at the moment we can sort of have this funnel where we're putting people into this Discord, but eventually, I think, as you say there, with the interfaces getting cleaner, which they will inherently do. If you look at web development, but way back when you'd have to use something like Dreamweaver to put a website together, now you can go on Wix, GoDaddy, whatever it is, and you can just drag and drop, and you can create a website in 20 minutes, or use a template and have something up pretty quick. And also with that as well, AI coming into web development as well. That's a total different conversation in itself.
Yeah, right.
I love what you mentioned there about Scalar 2, because I use Scalar 2, and it's fantastic. And I used it much like you mentioned there. I released an EP last year, and I wanted to come up with a different bass part for the second verse, albeit I wanted it to be the same, but with a subtle nuance change there. And I used Scalar 2 for that exact reason. So I think it's fantastic for doing that. And I've often said to people as well, if you're going to use something like that and you're going to use it to solve a problem, a really good way to look at it as well is to think, okay, well, maybe it solved it for me. Let's reverse engineer it and see how it's come up with that, how it's got to that decision.
Yeah.
You can use that as like a learning process, which I think is really, really cool. One question I did have for you, and I've seen this particularly with social media, is can you pick out, say if you were to, let's think musically, like music in terms of a song, could you pick out something that's been AI generated at the moment? Do you think it's quite easy to do?
Well, the easiest way is just by resolution. Because
of course, yeah.
AI cannot do high resolution, so that's the first thing. And what you tend to get is very generic melodies, generic chord changes that don't change much. So you'll have one section and maybe a second section that you'll have, and they repeat over and over and over. And it's hard to get multiple sections that a typical song form would have. So, for instance, intro, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, interlude, second verse, and it's so on with an interlude, with a bridge. And then you don't get that with AI right now. It kind of reveals itself right away. Now, that being said, there are a lot of songs that are kind of made that way, where they're just made on a loop.
Yeah.
So, you look at it and you say, well, okay, it's not doing it the traditional method that we used to do, and AI maybe is mimicking that. One of the things I noticed is most AI music generators tend to do electronic music very well.
Okay.
There's two reasons. One is AI kind of lends itself to those types of sounds, first of all. But second of all, a lot of the programmers are young, and in that age, that is their favorite type of music. So the platform tends to favor that somewhat.
Interesting.
So what we find is many times we get much more advanced advanced versions of songs that are two things, actually, both electronic and, surprisingly enough, some sort of hardcore punk, almost metal.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It likes... AI is very good at chaos. AI music is very good at chaos and distortion.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Having been in a metal band, and the audience will have heard me say this many times, chaos and distortion often comes with being in metal. So it's interesting you mentioned there about electronic music. Now, I suppose in a way, because ultimately it boils down to ones and zeros, it's binary, isn't it? The building blocks of computing and computer science. Is it? I suppose if you were to then, compare that with an acoustic-led track or something along those lines, I suppose it's going to be harder for it to authentically replicate it. But I guess as it ingests more and more data as the time goes on and gets more and more sophisticated, then it will be interesting to see how it goes. What are your thoughts on I've heard you mention this on the other podcast that I mentioned earlier about you licensing vocals and using that as a creative tool. So being able to upload what you perceive the melody to be, then actually having, say you wanted, it's not going to be Elton John, but someone similar in that particular style. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's certainly it's something that's being used now by professional songwriters, believe it or not. And the reason why is if they're going to pitch it to, I'm going to say Taylor Swift, even though she usually doesn't take songs that she didn't write, but if they want to pitch a song, they want it to sound like Taylor Swift. And so they'll get a vocalist that will sound like that. And that's generally the case where a pro songwriter feels that they're going to have a better chance of getting a song placed if the particular artist can identify with it easier. So as a result, getting a sound-like vocal is very important to them. Rather than paying $100 an hour to a vocalist, it's easier to license a vocal that is, similar and will do it in a flash. So that's something that's being used now, especially in songwriter demos, things like that. But I see a big future in that, and already there are a number of platforms that are specifically designed to ingest virtual vocalists, but also include them on the royalty payments. So and also think about the name, image, likeness portion of it as well. So that it's being thought out. One of the biggest problems with AI platforms is they don't understand. They always. I don't want to make this blanket. Many times they don't understand the implications of copyright. So what will happen is, the typical thing is, you can generate this piece of music, but you can't publish it anywhere.
Yeah.
For free. Okay, you pay us $9 a month, and guess what? Now you can publish it on YouTube and pick another platform. Oh, you want to pay it? Oh, and by the way, we own the copyright. Oh, you pay us $30 a month, and you can own the copyright, and you can do whatever you want with it. Now, they're assuming that they could own the copyright, and I've talked to many top IP attorneys about this who say that assumption is wrong. Because in the United States anyway, there's already been a ruling that you cannot have a 100% generated, AI-generated song, creation of any type really, that can't be copyrighted. So now here we have a platform that's doing that, and by nature it can't be copyrighted, but the platform is saying, oh, we own the copyright. So that becomes a problem, and we're seeing this happen in more and more platforms where you really have to dive down and read the terms of service to understand who owns what and what the implications are. Now, that being said, there are some platforms that are very upfront about it, saying, you own everything, we own nothing. And those would be the ones I'd suggest to go to, because it's the least amount of hassle down the road. So, nothing is a hassle in copyright until it starts to make money.
Yeah.
So
and,
there you go. If you're not making money, it's not a problem. As soon as you start to make money, then the knives come out.
Yeah, and I read that throughout your book, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier as well, about how the geographical location comes into play as well, because you can have something created on one side of the world, and then you are located. I suppose the beauty of being connected via the internet is that I can then download it here, but am I still under the copyright laws in Asia, for example? But as you mentioned then, until you actually start making like dollar on it, then you're probably going to be relatively okay. One thing I like about the idea of licensing vocals as well, I'm not a vocalist, I wish I was, I wish I could sing, but I can't, unfortunately, is that it's like another sort of platform for them to monetize their voice, because there's things like Vocalizer, where I've used it, where you can go on there and then you could pitch your project, and then they submit and then say, okay, and blah, blah, you go down the route of that. But now it's just another platform, I guess, for them to monetize their skill set. And I didn't know this until I read your book about the using artificial intelligence as well with regards to backing vocals with Isotope Nectar 4. I didn't know that was a thing that you could do, and I think Waves do it as well. There's a Waves plugin.
Yeah, there is.
I saw an advert on YouTube for it. But I think things like that are just amazing. I don't know what it sounds like at the moment. Have you used any of those tools? I'm assuming you used the Isotope one. One
of the things about Nectar that you have to understand is it's not giving you harmony; it's giving you background vocals. So it's giving you male, female, and different octaves.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you'll have to repitch everything. It's not automatically coming up with harmonies for you. With the Waves one does. The Waves one harmonizes things. I haven't played with that yet, but that's what I've read about it.
Yeah, it looks very interesting. I didn't know that about Nectar 4, so I'm going to bear that in mind, because I was going to dive into that tomorrow and have a look. But
Still worth having a look, because you don't always need harmony vocals. So yeah,
very true. There is one big question. It's not my notes here, but this comes up a lot, and this is to do with mastering AI, and that has come on leaps and bounds. I know Logic just at the end of last year released its incarnation of a mastering mix bus plugin, which is really good for. As a matter of fact, I put it at the end just to give for reference of what it could sound like, and I've had that conversation a lot on the podcast about, okay, well, you've got these platforms, Cloud Bounce, et al., and you can use them and think, okay, this is what my master could sound like. But having read your book, and you mentioned how they've come on a long way in the past sort of like 5 to 10 years compared to what they were before, where do you see that going with regards to mastering? What is your advice if you've got an independent artist who is thinking of using AI in mastering?
Well, if it's a major label project, they'll always go to a mastering engineer. Mm-hmm. So and they're willing to spend the money, so that's not so much a concern there. But if you're an indie artist, you're on a budget, then the online mastering programs, or I'd say the online ones, are better than something like Ozone, because Ozone can take you down the rabbit hole if you're not careful, and could actually make things worse instead of better. You just have to understand to follow what it's telling you. But that being, most people can't do that, unfortunately. They're going to tweak. But that aside, the online mastering platforms are really, really good. And not only that, they're so close to real mastering engineer that the difference is almost like, should I spend the money, the extra money? I've tested this myself with songs that I have that were mastered, and I would take the stereo mix, put it in various mastering platforms, and then compare it to the one that was mastered with an engineer, and it was really close, really close. The mastering engineer would beat it, but not by much. So you think, is it worth the extra money, or is it worth the money I don't have? So that's always the question. That being said, there is a trick, and the trick is it needs a good reference. So the reference track would preferably be something that's already mastered and could be a hit. I mean, you can go to Spotify and download a track. Actually, it doesn't download the track. What it does is just copies the EQ and compression, so you don't have to worry about any copyright violation or anything there. And then it just matches it. That is a secret. So you find a song, you think, I really want it to sound like that. You tell the mastering platform, here's my reference, make it sound like this, and it does. So that will sound substantially better than if you just go to the mastering platform and say, do it. So, and it doesn't take that much more in order to make that happen. So there are downfalls with the platforms. I think these will, I shouldn't say downfalls, it's more like there are some technical flaws that aren't thought through yet.
Yeah.
One of the big things is mastering engineers are particularly good at putting an album together. And there is some skill in this that is overlooked by almost everybody who isn't a mastering engineer, because they think, oh, it's just adding some EQ and compression and making it loud. No, a mastering engineer will take 10 songs and put them together, make them sound like they were all done in the same place, and they have the same volume, they have the same tonal characteristics. This is especially important when you do have songs that are done in different places with different people. Even if it's the same artist, there's a different sound. The mastering engineer, that's one of the expertises they have, is to actually make sure everything sounds like it's in the same universe. So that's particularly good. And then if you're doing vinyl or CD and cassette, it's important that the spreads are taken into account. Spread is the time in between the songs, which producers have taken a lot of time figuring that out over the years. It would be a whole session just to figure out what the time would be, so the album will flow. So AI eventually will be able to do this, but it doesn't do it now. And it doesn't do multiple songs, or most of them don't anyway. So that's something you have to consider. Oh, I'm doing this album, there's 10 songs, I have to sound like, all the same. So is my platform going to do that for me?
Yeah, it's we're going right back to what you said at the beginning of that there about the rabbit holes. Really interesting with Isotope in particular, because I think I had this conversation with a mastering engineer around this time last year, and it was very much the same in that you've got all these options, and it can also almost be like, okay, well, they're all there, and maybe I must use them, and then you could end up going down these rabbit, and you get to the point of diminishing returns, and then you could end up just destroying what it is you've actually done. So I think that's a key thing to be aware of, and a really good thing, a point for the listeners as well. And also using a good reference, I think, like you mentioned there, just to hammer that home is key. But what you mentioned there about the online platforms like Lander, etc. Now, I wonder, from an independent artist perspective, and I had this conversation, I think it was with Jay actually on episode 130, about how the single releases now are incredibly popular. Obviously, we're still releasing EPs and albums, but singles seem to be the way to go, and I've seen that notably with independent artists. And I wonder if that's part of the reason why you're seeing these online platforms are getting more and more popular, is because, okay, I just need a single, and to put a single out, and it's a lot quicker. It'd be interesting to know if there's a correlation between the amount of singles being released versus EPs and albums and online platforms. But I guess it's also to do with the fact that they are getting much better in terms of mastering. Yeah.
I think that's true. One of the things that really confused me about some of the online platforms, mastering platforms, is they would have a monthly plan or a yearly plan where you can do thousands of tracks.
Wow.
And I would say to myself, who does that many? But then I had a conversation with someone at Lander who said, oh, you'd be surprised. There are songwriters, for instance, that want all of their stuff, and they're prolific, and they'll be doing 10 songs a week. So, they need something like that. There's engineers, for instance, that will be doing mixes, and they'll have 5 mixes of the same song that have variations, and they'll have to master them all in order to present them to the client for them to sign off. So there are many applications where you need that volume, although I don't think most humans need that. So most musicians.
Yeah, that is a lot. We're now 130 plus episodes in. I had this conversation probably about halfway into that number, and it was with an artist, and they were telling me how they had written, I think it was like 1,000 songs in a year, and I was just like, wow, that is something else. But when they explained it to me, I was like, okay, well, I can kind of see how you've done that. And I think maybe written was used very loosely in terms of like they'd started and they got the various incarnations of a release. So yeah, I think that was used quite loosely, but it is quite impressive. I mean, it took me a year to do 4 songs.
Yeah,
but,
yeah, right. No, I know.
Yeah, it's interesting. But also going back to what you mentioned there about how at the moment, obviously, the subtleties of a mastering engineer being able to position the songs and having the space in between, etc. I wonder if we'll get to a point whereby you could say, actually, I like the song order of this album and the spaces in between, and then you feed that into an algorithm and then say, I want my album to be similar to that. But I guess that's then when copyright might come in and you're having to present the album. But I wonder if that's an avenue it might go down.
Well, it doesn't quite work like that, because what you're trying to do is, generally speaking, so there's a song at one tempo, and you're counting it in the space, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then into the next song. Mm-hmm. So it's all based on tempo. Now, that should be easy for an algorithm to figure out, for an AI platform to figure out, but it would mean that every song has a slightly different space in between. There are also times when you need crossfades, and right now we don't get that, crossfades in between masters.
Yeah.
So that and again, that shouldn't be a problem either down the road. I just haven't gotten that far with it yet.
Interesting stuff. Before we move on to the next question, there is another sort of plugin that I just wanted to get your thoughts on. I haven't used it yet, but there are plugins, and I'm going to reference one in particular, Golfos. I think I pronounced it correctly. And I've seen that a lot on social media, and producers, artists, engineers using it to finish their master. Maybe if you could just dive into a bit of the idea behind that and what maybe artists should be aware of if they're using a platform, or a VST rather, like that, something like Golfos. Yeah,
there's actually another one that's similar. I just focused on it on my blog yesterday. It's called, from Hornet, it's called Sleek, which is basically the same thing. And these are kind of a new kind of equalizer. They're tonal balancers. So instead of, we use brute force on equalizers where I'm going to boost 3K, and throughout the whole song, it's boosted at 3K. But it may not need to be boosted all the way through the song. Let's say for a vocalist is moving on the microphone, so sometimes we get that 3K peak, and other times it's perfect, and other times there's not enough of it. So a tonal balancer uses AI to, in real time, figure out what the ideal tonal balance is. And it's across a lot of bands. I think with Golfos, it's 128 bands that they're looking at. And these are constantly tweaking as you go through to ideally balance it out. This may be the new EQ. 5 years from now, we may not be using EQ as we know it today, because this is another way to do it that's quite interesting and quite good. Now, obviously, there are still things that we use equalizers for. We use them for color. Sometimes we do need a big boost someplace or a big cut someplace, so it's very useful there. But for very small changes, and these are especially good at minute changes over time, these tonal balancers are very good. I think there's a Focusrite one as well. There's quite a few of them that have popped up in the last year.
Yeah, it'd be amazing to see, as again, and what I mentioned earlier about in 5 years' time, to see where it's all at. And in particular with that as well, and the tonal balance side of things. And once again, I think for the audience listening, and I do this, and I'm sort of an advocate of doing it, I think if you're going to use that, I think in terms of like an educational perspective, is to break it down and think, okay, well, if it's doing that, why is it doing it? I think that's quite an important thing to do. And then, as I mentioned earlier about reverse engineering, it's much like if you're a programmer as well, because I've done a bit of that in the past. You sort of like, okay, well, that script does that code does that. How does it do it? And then you can learn the subtleties and the nuances of it that way. Bobby, I'm well aware of the time here, and I don't want to obviously keep you too long today, but maybe we could finish it off with some sort of myths and misconceptions. Maybe you could talk about some of the most prevalent misconceptions surrounding AI in music production that you've encountered.
Yeah, the biggest one is that you could go to one of the more common AI music apps, Boomy, for instance, Aiva, one of those, and just type in, make me a Taylor Swift song. And it's going to come out sounding just like Taylor Swift, just in that simple prompt. It doesn't work that way. And in fact, all of these sound-alikes that you hear are done the traditional way, where there's actually somebody that programs it up, that copies a particular Taylor Swift, Drake. There's a lot of them that are out there now. They copy a particular song or a particular style, and they program it up, and then they get the vocal, and they get one of these vocalizers. They get, an AI vocalizer, and then they put Taylor Swift or Drake or Ed Sheeran or you name it, or John Lennon, and they put it on top. So it's not like you're going to that particular AI and it's going to spit out something exactly like one of those artists. So that's the big one. It doesn't work quite the way everybody thinks or wants. Most pro musicians don't want that. It's mostly people that are not players that really want to do that. And that's what some of these platforms focus on. They focus on the non-player for the most part. So that's one. The other big one that we sort of touched on before was there's a resolution problem. And if you think of it, if you're going to generate a picture, a photorealistic image, best way to put it, it just has to do it once. If you're going to do a video, it's doing it 30 times a second. So that's not terribly taxing. But when it comes to audio, and you really want it at the lowest possible resolution that's acceptable, it's at 44,100 times a second. So that puts a lot of stress on the AI and especially on the hardware involved. And then it's only 16-bit for the most part as well. Anybody that's been doing a lot of high-end recording, especially for record labels, knows that at least in the past 10 years, and for me it's been 20 years, I haven't recorded anything at less than 96K, 9624. And generally, a record label is going to demand that in their delivery specs. So that means that whatever you're getting out of AI, it's, you're going to have to upsample it, and upsampling isn't really giving you what you need. So that's a big limitation. We're starting to see bits and pieces of that changing in certain platforms, but it's going to cost you. So that's another big myth that's there. Let's see, what's the third one? Those are the two that come to mind in music generation, anyway.
Yeah, maybe there's only two.
I think there's more. That's all I can remember. I haven't read that chapter in a while.
What I was going to mention actually off the back of that there was, and I think you mentioned this before, you may have mentioned it in the book, or it might have been on another podcast, was the uses of it at the moment. I think one particular good use of it is for sort of sounds in commercials and TV in the background. Yeah. I think that's a really good, at the moment, that's one use of it I can see being really good. Now, if your profession, if your sort of remit is to create music for that, I don't know how scared you would be of that, but I think that's where it could be used quite extensively. If you quickly want to get you get those clients like West Coast Customs, you get that hard guitar in the background, and you can think, okay, well, AI, can you create a 30-second snippet for me? I think it could be used quite a lot in that. I can see that going forward.
Yeah, I think a lot of that's not a myth, that's actually happening, but that's one of the areas in music that is threatened by AI, and that's what we'd call production music. Production music is music behind any kind of video. And for the most part, anything that's high-end, they're going to use real music, so that's not threatened there. But anything that's kind of low-end, especially like YouTube documentaries and things like that, they're going to go for the lowest common denominator, cheapest thing they could get, and AI more than fills the bill in many cases. That said, that is not as easy to do as well. Because if you have something very specific in mind and you go and you ask the AI generator to do it, it may take you a lot of tries to get in the ballpark.
Yeah.
So therein lies a problem, and a lot of that has to do with the interface. The interface is looking for a prompt, and for some, excuse me, got a bit of a cold here. And for someone who isn't used to developing prompts and detailed prompts, it can take a while to really streamline something to come up with exactly what you're looking for. I got to the point, I got to tell you, I ran into this. I wanted something for my podcast. When I hit number 500, I was going to change the music. And I did this. I went to the various AI platforms. And I got to the point where it's like, I could write something faster than this. I wound up actually taking something I did, a long time ago and using that instead. It's not that I'm giving up on it. It's just like I ran out of time.
Yeah.
So sometimes you think the AI is going to come up with something that's going to be perfect right off. That's maybe a big myth and fallacy right there, that it's going to be fast and easy. And many times it's not what you think. It's going to take much more time.
Yeah. Going back to what you said about prompting, and I remember having a conversation with someone a while back on social media about this, and it kind of falls into like how good a prompter you are. I think that there is a key part in that, because I remember when I first started using ChatGPT, I can't remember, I think it was like create a social media post for me, and that I pretty much just put that, and off the back of that, I was just like, well, this isn't very good. Then I realized actually there's quite a skill. It's quite a skill. If you want to, it's because essentially it's all down to you as a prompter. The computers, for all intents and purposes, they need that human input, and like how good you are at prompting is going to be key to what you get out at the end. In your book, there's in particular with regards to, I think there was, I can't remember if it was a blog or for what it was for, but the way you laid it out and saying, okay, you need to tell it who you are, tell it what it is, and then describe exactly what it is you want off the back of it, and then in bullet points as well. And then at the end of it, I've never done this before with it, is actually ask it, do you understand? And I never thought of doing that. And just little things like that can really help. I don't know where I was going with this, but I think what I was trying to say is like being really, really good at prompting, I think is going to be key. But I also think, going back to what you said earlier about how user interfaces, and as soon as they get more sophisticated, is that the wrong word, but they're easier to navigate, more intuitive, and then it could have the prompts for you there on screen. I think it's really exciting to see how it could go. I think with regards to interfaces, I think if they're made, going back to what we said earlier, if they're made easier to navigate and then also prompt, I think you're going to get some really, really good stuff out of it. Really, really good. One last thing I wanted to mention, and you mentioned this in the book again, and I was incredibly impressed by this, and I haven't listened to it yet, is the fact that you can get a stereo WAV file or similar and then separate it out into individual stems, which I think is amazing. I think it was done in the Beatles film, if I remember rightly, or something along those lines.
Well,
maybe you could talk a tiny bit about that.
The AI separation is very good right now, and there's a lot of platforms that will do this and do it well. Ripex is one that everybody seems to like, but there's lots of them. Moises is another one. The process that you're talking about with the Beatles is the Peter Jackson proprietary process. Peter Jackson, the director from New Zealand. I went to a playback at EMI of the Beatles' Revolver. It was done in Atmos. And Giles Martin, the producer, was there, and he was talking us through everything. And he stopped and he said, okay, so you have to keep in mind, this was all a 4-track. And they managed to spread things out, but very tastefully, I have to say. And then he said, okay, on track 1, it's 2 guitars, bass, and drums, all on 1 track. But we could separate all of those out, including on the drums, separate kick and separate snare. And then he went and he played them for us, and it sounded so isolated, it was amazing. So Peter Jackson's process is leaps and bounds ahead of everybody else, but there are lots of good ones, and certainly, if there's a couple, I won't say faults, but a couple downfalls here if you're using it. Usually it will default, almost all of them default to a certain number of stems. And that will be vocals, bass, and it might be keyboards or guitar, and then other, it will say, and that's kind of like everything else, and drums. So you get 5. And people want more stems than that. So I've talked to several of these companies that are saying, yeah, we're working on that, or it's available, but it's only available on our private label, or, something like that. The other thing that people really want, and it's funny because I was just talking to a sound mixer the other night for movies, Alan Meyerson, who's one of the top guys, does all the tentpole movies, and he was saying something that I hear this from everybody. What I want is I want to take background vocals or a choir, and I want to separate those out.
Yeah.
And none of them are good at that yet. Now, Peter Jackson's may be. I haven't heard it being used in that case. But the separation technology is fantastic, except for something like that. So there are these things here that people want that it's still not providing. But for the most part, I think it's fantastic, what it can do. Just about any of them. It's worth playing with, for sure.
Most definitely. And I like what you said there, and I think it's concurrent throughout the chat today. It's all about yet, isn't it?
Yeah.
You say that you can't do it, but yet. It's that growth mindset with AI, and eventually it will get to that point. And I think being able to separate stems out like that, and I get this frequently if an artist were to send me a WAV file and they say, I've lost the project, or I've lost the session, which happens so much.
Yeah.
And they're like, and I listen to it and I was like, yeah, you could do this, this, and this. And I feed back and they're like, yeah, I don't have that anymore. So that's what it is. And in instances like that, I think it's going to be amazing. But it's really, really exciting stuff. And the book, again, just as I said at the beginning, it's absolutely fantastic. So I'm going to put a link to that in the episode show notes for the audience to go and check out. But Bobby, it's been fantastic chatting with you today. I've been super excited about this, and I think the audience are going to get loads out of it. Just for the audience listening, if they want to learn more about yourself, your blog, your podcast, where should they go online?
If you go to bobbyowsinski.com, bobbyowsinski.com, and from there you can find the podcast, you can find excerpts from my books, you can buy the books if you want, you could find my podcast, blogs, all that stuff just from that one URL.
Lovely stuff. I will put that link in the episode notes, so audience, do go check that out. And as I say, fantastic resource of a wealth of information there, so do go check it out. Bobby, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm well aware of the time zone, so I'm going to leave you now to get on with the rest of your day, and I'm going to go have some dinner. So it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I will catch up with you soon.
Thanks, Mark.